Hello, everyone. Um, Welcome to the first of three really exciting virtual events that we have. We are going to be covering a lot of really important issues about mail voting, and we want to set the record straight where there's been confusion or debate. Everyone's heard a lot about mail voting in the past couple of years, especially when it comes to Pennsylvania. So we've convened a really cool group of panelists. There's going to be some rotating guests over the next few weeks. This is the first of three events, and it's sponsored by the Committee of 70, All Voting is Local, and Pitt Cyber, which is at the University of Pittsburgh. Just to set the table a little bit, mail voting has been around for generations in Pennsylvania, but with Act 77 of 2019, which we will talk a little bit more about, all of a sudden, anyone in the state who wants to vote and is eligible to vote can use a mail ballot. So now a lot of people are voting by mail. That transition has been challenging, but it's also been really exciting to watch. We have some new, more convenient ways for people to vote. We also still have in-person election day voting, and it's been really interesting to watch this whole system get set up. All right, we got some really cool panelists today. I am not one of the panelists, and I am not very cool, but I am the moderator. My name is Jonathan Lai. I'm a data and democracy reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. What that means is for the past several years, I've been covering voting rights. I've been covering election administration. I write about all the ways in which people can vote, why they vote, the ways in which they cast their ballots, how those votes are counted, and what happens after that. Here with us today is Dory Sawyer. Dory, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I am Dory Sawyer. I am the Director of Elections for Montgomery County. We are the third largest county in Pennsylvania, located just outside of Philadelphia. Our total number of voters is just over 600,000. We are third behind Philadelphia County and Allegheny County. We have a very robust and engaged electorate here in Montgomery County, and I'm very excited to be here tonight.
All right, excited to have you. We also have with us Jeff Greenberg, who has run many, many elections in Pennsylvania. Jeff, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Jonathan. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Greenberg. I am currently the senior advisor to an organization called the Voter Project here in Pennsylvania, and we focus on mail voting. And as Jonathan indicated, I was the director of elections in Mercer County over here on the western side of the state, as we like to say, the best side of the state, from 2007 until 2020. And during that time, I administered 28 elections here in Pennsylvania.
That's awesome. And we also have a guy named Al Schmidt, who also ran a bunch of elections in Philly and now does some other stuff. Al, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Al Schmidt. I'm president and CEO of the Committee of 70, headquartered here in Philadelphia. For the past 10 years, I was city commissioner of Philadelphia. We have 3 city commissioners, 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, and I was the Republican city commissioner for the past 10 years before joining Committee of 70. I am, Jeff, and you might know this, from the Western Pennsylvania originally. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and I'm the only person to move from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia in their lifetime. But I'm here now, and I love my adopted home, and ran a lot of elections here.
All right. So as you can see, we have a lot of really cool people, wide range of experiences, whole lot of elections that have been run under your belts. So this is going to be really fun. Why don't we start with some background? Jeff, considering the number of elections you ran, can you tell us about mail voting? Like, why have we heard so much about it recently?
Sure. And so, Jonathan, as you already mentioned, Act 77 of 2019 changed the landscape in Pennsylvania for voting. One of the things I always emphasized, I was in the office back in 2019, and I think most elections directors would have preferred it to say Act 77 of 2020 and would have been implemented in 2021 instead of 2020, but that's a whole different story. What I used to tell people when they would ask about the differences between what we had for generations in Pennsylvania and what Act 77 did was it came down to basically one line on the application, on the different applications. On the absentee ballot application, there was a line for an excuse. On the No excuse, as you could imagine, mail-in ballot applications, there's no line. It's literally one line, which is the difference between the two processes. As you said, generations of people have voted by absentee ballot in Pennsylvania. The processes for both mail-in and absentee voting is the same. The way the ballots are counted, the way the counties prepare, the way the counties handle the applications. We know that people have been voting by absentee ballot in Pennsylvania at least as far back as the Civil War. And I actually found a reference. I haven't been able to confirm this, Jonathan, so I'm going to put this on your table. I've seen a reference that Pennsylvania actually utilized some form of absentee voting during the War of 1812. And there was some legislative action apparently in 1813, which permitted that version. So I'll give you a good story to chase down. It might be some interesting historical perspective there. So look, it's been here. Nothing changed in 2019, except for the fact that anybody who wanted to vote by mail could. And that's really the point that I think that needs to be emphasized.
All right. Well, at the time, because of how restrictive absentee voting was at the time, right, it was very limited. You had to have very specific reasons for why you were allowed to vote absentee.
Yes.
Things like being outside of your municipality on election day. And so actually for a long time, even though generations of Pennsylvanians have been voting by mail, it was actually only around 5% of the votes were cast by mail, right? Somewhere around 95% of votes were cast in person. That has totally changed. Right? Even if a lot of the processes are the same, just the scale of voting by mail is very different. And so before 2020, most Pennsylvanians had never voted by mail before. That's just like a new experience for them. So Dory, why don't we start with you? And this can be very much a conversation, but can you explain to us like what actually happens when I'm trying to vote by mail in Pennsylvania? If I've never done it before, can you walk me through what you are doing when I send in my application? What are you checking?
Sure. So the first thing that we do is we check to make sure that you are registered to vote. If you're not registered to vote, we use the contact information you've provided on that application to get in touch with you to let you know, hey, Jonathan, you're not registered to vote. We're going to set this aside, help you get registered to vote, then we can process this application. If you are registered to vote, we are going to make sure that there's an information match. You're going to, if you haven't entered on the mail-in ballot application or the absentee ballot application, it is asking for your driver's license, state ID number, or the last 4 digits of your social security number. That triggers an automatic check in the voter registration system, which will run the information you've provided against the information that the agency has. If that information matches, your application is approved, your ballot goes out, you vote it, it comes back, everything is copacetic. If that information is mismatched, we may not be able to count your ballot until you get back in touch with us to further verify your identity. We can receive mail-in ballot applications throughout the year. You can apply for a mail-in ballot for just one election, for both elections. If you are a snowbird, we do have a lot of those in Pennsylvania, people who seek out that warmer Florida weather in the winter, and then maybe are here in the spring. College students as well. So we are able to send that mail-in ballot application or that mail-in ballot to a different address than the one you are registered at. We do have a great system of verifying your identity to know that you are the one who has applied for it through that Pennsylvania driver's license or state ID or the last 4 of that social security number.
Awesome. And so those various checks that you're doing where you're making sure that the identification is right, that people are eligible to vote, stuff like that, you actually don't just do that once anymore, right? Can you talk?
No, correct. So if you have applied to receive mail-in ballots for the entire year, we verify your identity just ahead of the May primary, and then again in just ahead of the November general election. That way we are making sure that those addresses are up to date. So if you've moved and it slipped your mind to tell us that we're able to kind of flag that information and again, get in touch with you. Hey, you moved, you still want a mail-in ballot? Where does it need to go? So that we were able to kind of keep up with you and make sure that we're not mailing ballots to somewhere where they're not supposed to go. Also, mail-in ballots cannot be forwarded by the United States Postal Service. They will actually bring them back to us as an undeliverable mail item. Again, we do want to enfranchise as many voters as possible. So if you have completed that mail-in ballot, we do want to try to get it to you before it's going to go into the mail. Another thing that I'd like to point out is that even if you do fill out multiple mail-in ballot applications or absentee ballot applications, we are still only going to send you one ballot because it is tied to your voter registration. So if Jeff were to fill out a mail-in ballot application, say in February, after we've completed our annual mailing of mail-in ballot applications, and June rolls around, or it gets to be September, and he's like, man, I need to apply for a mail-in ballot, and he accidentally fills out a second application, we're going to email him very politely and say, hey, Jeff, we're actually going to decline this second ballot application. It's a duplicate. We already have you on the list. You're good to go.
And Jonathan, just to add a little bit as far as the verification goes, you actually have a third level of verification occurring when the voter registers. The county is also verifying their identity at that point too. So once you get to the mail ballot place, that's actually a second and a third verification of the voter's ID.
Yep, correct. In our standard voter roll maintenance that occurs every year as well.
All right, so I just want to make sure I sort of understand that correctly. You're applying to vote by mail that year, or maybe that election specifically. Once that happens, Dory, what I'm hearing is that you're actually doing multiple types of checks on my information to make sure that the information is accurate. I'm who I say I am. I'm allowed to get this ballot. I'm allowed to vote, right? All of that.
Correct.
But that's actually like one time you do that, and then you might do it again. Like you'll do it again for the next election.
Correct. And if at any time during this process, a voter were to move out of state or pass away, that actually stops all processes. So a ballot would not be created for them. So if Al, for example, were to decide to move back to Pittsburgh, the Philadelphia office would be notified, his voter registration would be transferred, or maybe not Pittsburgh, maybe if he were to move to Hawaii, he'd like to retire somewhere in the sun. Any further interaction on his Pennsylvania voter registration is going to cancel. We won't be able to issue any ballots in his name. He'll be no further actions can be taken on that ballot. Same thing if someone were to pass away. If they are marked as deceased, we're not able to issue ballots in their name or process any further types of applications or address changes.
So I just want to be sure I understand here. I'm only going to receive a mail ballot if I've applied for it, right? You're never going to send me a ballot that I didn't ask for.
Correct.
Okay. Al, I do remember in 2020, everyone was so overwhelmed. It was like there was a lot going on. The elections offices were overwhelmed. But I also remember a lot of voter confusion. I remember voters were submitting these applications and getting them denied as duplicates. And people were saying, why did I get a pre-filled application? Sometimes they thought it was a ballot. Sometimes it was like, why is my pet getting a ballot? Can you just clear up some of that confusion for us?
And around election time, campaigns and parties and candidates frequently send out election-related information. And in this case, Republican organizations send out applications to Republicans to apply to vote by mail. Always has. Republican Party of Pennsylvania that I used to work for some time ago would do an absentee ballot application mailing to voters it identified were eligible to vote by absentee ballot, or had in the past voted by absentee ballot. So mailing out an application, there's nothing magical about that piece of paper. It's simply an application. But in the environment that we're in, with so much misinformation and disinformation sort of swirling around, it doesn't take much for someone to receive an application in the mail, then go on Facebook and say, why did Philadelphia send me a ballot? I didn't request one. Well, they didn't send you a ballot. And in our sort of, I think the terminology is laboratory democracy, that we have 50 states sort of running elections their own way. And in our Commonwealth, 67 counties with some difference county to county. In Doris County, you fill out, when you vote in person, you fill out the ballot. You know, it's like a hand-marked kind of paper ballot. And in ours, it's a ballot marking device that the voter verifies those selections on the ballot. Is you get bombarded with all sorts of information that probably doesn't make sense to a lot of people with busy lives, working 2 jobs, you know, trying to, you know, pick up their kids and get groceries and all the rest. And New Jersey in 2020 mailed out ballots to all registered voters. Pennsylvania did not. And I think that sort of laboratory democracy is something that we benefit from because it's sort of trial and error. And what might work in Wyoming might not work in Rhode Island. But at the same time, it adds, I think, an opportunity for bad faith actors to sort of create confusion in all this, and normal people with busy lives kind of not understanding it. It seems like a mystery. What's all this hearing? What is all this I'm hearing about elections? Seems controversial. And I think that's contributing to the environment that we're presently in.
Yeah. So just to make sure I know what to do, Jeff, if I receive some of those mailers and I think something's wrong, or I just don't know if it's legitimate, or I'm just confused, right? What should I do? What's the course of action for
Look,
me?
the easiest thing is to call your county election office. That's exactly what I advise voters. And look, I understand because we encountered voters who had that confusion in 2020. We had some voters who returned 5, 6 applications because every time they got one, they weren't sure. They were either thinking it came from the county and that something happened to the one they already sent. So I understand that. The easiest thing is call your county election office, let them confirm, hopefully talk you off the ledge and say, hey, we already have your application. You're good to go. Just throw away what you got in the mail.
All right. So,
And at no point, I'm sorry to interject, and at no point in terms of whether it's applications or ballots returned, does a voter have 2 mail-in ballots counted for themselves? Like, even if they requested one and received and you know, it hadn't arrived yet, and they get antsy and request the replacement ballot and then mail that ballot back as well. There's a system in place to prevent double voting, whether it's voting by mail through one or with more than one ballot, or voting at the polls on election day and voting by mail.
so Al, I'd actually love it if you would talk a little bit more about what happens once I've actually returned the ballot, right? So I've submitted my application and my county has checked it. I'm legit. They send me a ballot. I have the ballot in front of me. I fill it out. I return it. Whatever method, and we can talk a little bit more about some of those methods later. You now on election night have my ballot. What are you doing to actually make sure that that's a legitimate vote that should count? I assume you're not just opening the ballots willy-nilly and just counting them, right?
Yeah, there's nothing willy-nilly about any part of this whole process. It's extremely regimented and methodical from tooth to tail. So when your ballot is returned, the County Board of Elections will immediately timestamp that ballot envelope, so they know when it was returned, before 8 p.m. on election day, on or before election day. And then counties do all sorts of things prior to election day to organize those mail-in ballots. Like in our case, with 1,703 divisions or precincts in the city, we organize them by ward and precinct so that if we need to locate the ballot, we can find it. But we can't begin any of the process for counting a mail-in ballot prior to 7 a.m. on election day. And that is a unique disadvantage that Pennsylvania is experiencing. We have other states, blue states, red states, Democratic states, Republican states, and they allow their boards of elections to begin processing those mail-in ballot envelopes prior to election day, so that on election day, they're simply counting the votes. For us, we can't even begin the first stage of that process until 7 a.m. on election morning. And that stage is reviewing the envelope to ensure that the voter signed the envelope, that the envelope is signed. In the past, and this is probably something we'll touch on in later in our conversation, to determine whether it's signed and dated. That's what, what Philadelphia does. And that can only begin on 7 a.m. on election morning. Then there's opening that declaration envelope. Then there's extracting the secrecy envelope. Then there's opening the secrecy envelope. Then there's extracting the ballot. Then there's flattening the ballot. And that whole very mundane assembly line takes a lot of time. And in 2020, we had 375,000 voters vote by mail, and we couldn't process any of those ballots, begin processing the ballot envelopes until 7 a.m. on election morning, let alone counting those votes. So it's a real disadvantage. It's a big problem with an easy solution. It's frustrating to know that we're going to face it again in a couple of weeks, where we knew in 2020 and all said to each other, we can't ever allow this to happen again, where it takes, so much time to count mail-in ballot votes.
Jonathan, one of the other things that we do when a ballot comes back after it is timestamped is every ballot return envelope has a barcode on it. This is very similar to the barcode that you might find if your county uses printed poll books that you sign. That barcode has some unique identification information in it, similar to what you'd find at any grocery store. A lot of information in that barcode. So it has when we scan that barcode into our voter registration system, it pulls up your profile. It knows that it has information in it that matches to the ballot package, and I say package to refer to the ballot and the envelope. So it matches to that ballot package. It recognizes this is a ballot. This is an ID that was issued by Montgomery County. This envelope belongs to Dory Sawyer. Her ballot has been returned. That act triggers a couple of different mechanisms. It either sends an email to that voter to let them know that their ballot was received by the county. So if it was returned, yesterday, and I'm getting it back, if I had dropped that in the mail and I'm getting it back 2 days from now, I would get an email saying it's been received by the county. Great, voting's done. If I chose not to provide my email address on my original application, I can go on a ballot tracker powered by the Department of State that would say received by county. This also pulls my name out of the poll book and puts it onto in Montgomery County, and I believe every county does this the same way. In Montgomery County, we actually create a separate list for our poll workers to tell them every voter in their precinct who has already submitted a ballot, so that if I go to vote in person, there is no place in the poll book for me to sign. That means that the poll worker cannot issue me a ballot to vote in person. The best they could do is issue me a provisional ballot, which would then be taken back to voter services and canvassed at a later date. And it would only be opened if voter services verified that I had not cast a ballot in any other way. So that act of scanning that barcode in tells us that this ballot was issued by Montgomery County, that it was received in a timely manner, and gives the voter peace of mind that their ballot was received, and is just one piece of just one of the safeguards in place to prevent a single voter from casting two ballots.
And just to pick up on one thing Dory said there was, you get an email verification, you get an email notification if you provide your email address. What we saw, and I'm sure everyone saw in 2020 and since then, is you have a couple, or and one provides an email address and another doesn't, and they both mail their ballot back on the same day or drop it off at a Dropbox in the same day. One gets a notification, and then the other is concerned that the ballot wasn't received because they didn't get an email message, but they didn't get an email message notifying them because they didn't provide an email address. It's strange, the sort of tension there between how you can improve a system to make it more transparent and add reassurance that at the same time results in other people feeling like less assured that their ballot was received, but it was because they didn't provide an email address.
Yeah, these little communication pieces really are key. And for us, I mean, the only reason that I would use that email address is to get in touch with you about your ballot. If something were incorrect, for example, if we weren't able to verify your identity, we do send letters to your registered address. But if we don't hear from you, you do have 6 days, up until 6 days beyond the election. If we have not heard from you, we will pull up your voter registration and we will try to contact you by whatever method we have in your voter profile, because we want to be able to count your ballot. We want you to exercise your constitutional right to vote. So for us, we want to be as exhaustive as possible. If you've provided a phone number, if you've provided an email address, we're going to try to get in touch with you to say, hey, we're trying to reach you about your mail-in ballot, to try to make sure that we can count your vote, and that we are being as respectful and as diligent as we can in safeguarding on both sides. You know, we want to enfranchise as many legally cast ballots as we can.
And the key to that communication improvement is also to help the election offices avoid being overwhelmed by phone calls, which were just unbelievable as you headed close to election day. For all the voters who don't have emails, their only communication is, let's call the election office and see if they got my ballot. And we're sitting there with, thousands and thousands of ballots in trays. And it's like, well, can we go find this one person's ballot? Same thing happens with applications often too. When you get close to the application deadline, voters are digging in to see whether we got their application. So any way that communication can be improved would be helpful.
And I think the message there is, apply early. If you do plan to vote by mail, apply early, and return your ballot as early as possible, to kind of have that peace of mind and to give us that time. Montgomery County has over 600,000 registered voters. We have a lot of voters who vote by mail. I think our last count was about 115,000 processed applications. We've sent out around 112,000 mail-in ballots so far. They are starting to come back. It's a very busy, it feels a little bit like Santa's workshop at Christmas when all the ballots start coming back and we start kind of springing into that action time again. It's a very exciting time. That does, our call volume is starting to pick up, and our priority is, of course, getting back in touch with folks, but we have a lot of different processes going on. So the sooner you return that ballot and we can get that information to you, the better everybody feels.
And to put that in perspective, that's about 10% of the applications that have been processed in Pennsylvania so far, just coming out of that one county. So that's pretty remarkable.
Absolutely.
As I said, very engaged electorate in Montgomery County.
All right. So as part of the mis and disinformation, there's been such a dizzying amount of litigation in Pennsylvania around different parts of mail voting, even mail voting itself. The law has been litigated a bunch of times. And so as part of that, there is often just like so much good, bad, and misinformation out there around what's going on with that. Al, I ask you to put on a bit of a lawyer hat for us and just help us understand, like, first of all, just why are there so many lawsuits? How do we minimize the number of things that wind up in court?
So, Jonathan, I look like a lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer. I might have a suit and tie on and glasses and all that, but take my legal advice with a grain of salt. But as an observer of this process, Act 77 is still very new, only passed in 2019. We've only seen very minimal reforms to it right after the primary of 2020. 20 heading into the general of 2020. And there's still a lot to improve. And I'm sorry, my dog is barking. There's still a lot to improve. And because the law is pretty new, there's still a lot of things that I think still need to be settled. For example, in the news this week was a lot of back and forth about whether voters needed to hand date the mail-in ballot envelope for their ballot. And the law is really clear. It could not be more clear. The law passed by the Republicans in the House and the Republicans in the Senate and signed by the Democratic governor that says the voter must hand date that ballot. That being said, the courts have found, and I can see why, that has nothing to do with whether that voter's vote should really be counted or not. If they leave that blank, the ballot would have been potentially not counted. If they wrote their birthday or any given day on the date line, it would be counted. So it seems like it's a technicality that's being used to prevent ballots from being counted. Boards of elections know when they sent that ballot out. They know when that received that ballot back. They know it's a registered voter. They know it's the registered voter's eligible vote. And they know it was received back on or before election day. So a lot of the litigation, I think, is sort of settling things where one party or another, or candidate or another, is trying to gain advantage by preventing voters' votes from being counted. I mean, that's essentially what it is.
And I would add, Jonathan, that I think, and I know we were going to talk a little bit about this later, but I really think the omissions by the General Assembly in firming up these issues, such as notice and cure, drop boxes, all those issues, that's what's opened the door to litigation, because those issues were not settled in statute when Act 77 was passed. And that was something that needed to happen that did not. You still have, I forget, it's kind of called Bonner 2, that's still trying to challenge the constitutionality of Act 77. So that's not even dead yet. You have the other, and that's partly to do with, I think, the severability issue of Act 77. So there's so many things. And as you said, every time you talk about that or you see it as a voter, all it does is leads to doubts as to the validity of the system, sadly.
And I'm not trying to minimize it, but it's amazing how much controversy there is in the Commonwealth about mail-in ballot voting. There are plenty of other states that have done this for a long time. Some states that only vote by mail. Red states and blue states, like I said before, make full use of mail-in ballot voting. So all the litigation, I hope, at the end of the day, doesn't result in voters being confused or being dissuaded from casting their vote, whether it's in person on election day or whether it's voting by mail.
So there are things that are confusing. There are things that are actually just uncertain, right? With litigation, you might not know, you never know which way something is going to go. So a question like the dating of ballots, the Department of State, which oversees the elections that all the counties run, has told the counties that, yes, you should count undated ballots, but that's being litigated right now. So Dory, for your voters, right? Like, you are running an election right now in which you have so many voters voting by mail. We've heard about naked ballots in the past. We've heard about signatures. We've heard about dates. What should your voter do? We've heard about deadlines and timelines. What do you tell your voters? What should people do to make sure that their vote counts?
Yeah, that's a great question. What we included in every single ballot package is a handy list of instructions. We did it, obviously, after you voted your ballot. You don't want to write your name or make any identifying marks on your ballot. You'll fold that ballot up, pop it inside of that secrecy envelope. Again, just leave the secrecy envelope blank. Don't write your name or any identifying, make any identifying marks on that secrecy envelope. Seal the secrecy envelope, place it inside the larger return envelope, and then we are recommending that voters definitely sign it and also date that, regardless of which way they choose to return their ballot. In previous elections, this past election, we had a larger number of naked ballots than we had in the past. We did also see a larger number of just plain ballots dropped into the drop box that weren't in any envelopes. So no matter how you choose to vote, or how you choose to return that ballot, you do need to make sure that you're utilizing both of those envelopes. Montgomery County does use prepaid, postage paid envelopes, so you can drop that ballot into the mail without needing to put a stamp on it. If you are watching this presentation and you live in a different county, just make sure that you're checking that upper right-hand corner of the return envelope before dropping it into the mail, as some counties do offer prepaid postage and some do not. But regardless of the return style, sign date, use that secrecy envelope and make sure that it is back in your county's possession by 8 p.m. on election day.
And I think that's important because you often see that last message about back in the county's possession. Unfortunately, a lot of voters get confused just by the messaging to return your ballot by 8 p.m. on election day. And I can't tell you how many voters over the years believe that means return it to a post office box or a mailbox by 8 p.m. and they think that that's timely. And so it's important when you are emphasizing that deadline to voters to remind them it has to be in the county's possession by 8 p.m. on election day.
And I really can't say enough great things about our local postal team. The 3 postmasters that I work with very closely in Montgomery County, they really do work very hard with us, especially on election day, to make multiple deliveries so that we have an idea of how much is coming back and how much longer it will take us, so that we're able to keep accurate counts. They are really moving and hustling for us on election day. So a special shout out to my team here on the ground in Montgomery County. They really do a fantastic job for us.
And I just want to underscore what Jeff said about the deadline, because that hasn't always been the case in the past, right? That's always been the law with regard to the deadline. But in 2020, for example, in the primary, some voters in some of the counties around the state, including Philadelphia, you had a few extra days. You still had to return your ballot by election day, but postmarks did actually count. In the general election, there was a Supreme Court order that would have allowed that. So I just want to underscore here, 8 p.m. on election day is the deadline by which your ballot must be returned, which means it has to be received by the elections office. Your county elections office has to receive it. The postmark doesn't count. It doesn't matter that you thought you returned it on that day. It has to actually be received by the county.
And we get asked a lot about, when those deadlines are, but the deadline is like now. The deadline is at your absolute earliest convenience, because the law allows you to apply 7 days before election day to get your application in. So if your application is in to the county and the county does a miraculous job processing that mail-in ballot application and getting that ballot out the door the next day, it still has to be mailed to you. You still have to receive it. You still have to complete it. And if you're returning it by mail, you then have to mail it back to be received by 8 p.m. on election day. That is, in my opinion, a completely unreasonable amount of time. And the only kind of, what's it called? Not fail-safe, but the only thing that helps mitigate that is the availability of drop boxes, so that if a voter gets their ballot and they're concerned about being able to mail it back a few days before election day or Monday, the day before election day, they have the opportunity to return that mail-in ballot to a drop box directly to the Board of Elections so that their vote will be counted.
The other fail-safe there, if they're capable or they have the ability, is to do a provisional ballot at the precinct. So if there's a concern that their ballot is not going to be returned in time, they still would be able to do a provisional ballot once the county confirmed they did not receive, after post-election, that they did not receive their mail ballot in time.
Or bring their mail-in ballot with them, and then they can vote on the voting. They can vote in person without using a provisional ballot.
Bring their ballot declaration envelope.
Yeah. lots of different options for people to cast their ballot, but 8 p.m. by election day is definitely the deadline.
And that lines up with the close of polls, right? The polling places close at 8 p.m. Though, of course, if you're in line, you will still be allowed to vote. But it's sort of a easy to remember deadline. Election day voting ends at the same time as mail voting. 8 p.m. election day. That's your deadline. Al, you talked about drop boxes. Can you explain what a drop box is and how they work?
So some counties do it differently, but drop boxes are widely used across the country to allow voters in the closing days of an election to return their mail-in ballot directly to the Board of Elections instead of dropping it in the mail. And mail-in drop boxes have kind of been a very, I think, peculiar political target that I've seen, because essentially every mailbox is a drop box. Except the drop boxes, at least in Philadelphia and many other places, have 24-hour video surveillance of the drop box and retain and secure that surveillance. The mailbox at the end of the street, doesn't have that. So it's a really curious thing that they have become the targeted, like mail-in ballot drop boxes have been targeted the way they have, because in reality, it's just returning your ballot directly to the Board of Elections rather than returning it to your postal service employee to then deliver it back to the Board of Elections, which, as I said, is really important in the sort of closing days of an election.
So just to pull that out, when I drop my ballot in a postal mailbox, right, versus a drop box, the difference is that the postal service still has to deliver my ballot. But if I put it in the drop box, that is considered received by the county. Is that right?
If you put it in a mailbox, the postal service delivers it to the Board of Elections. If you put it in a drop box, you're delivering it directly back to the Board of Elections. And because those drop boxes are locked and secured at 8 p.m. on election night, and the ballots cast are retrieved, any ballot you can, and you can only drop off your own ballot in Pennsylvania, with a couple of exceptions where you get a sort of a declaration of assistance form to do it. If you drop your mail-in ballot in a drop box, it's going right back to the Board of Elections, so you can have peace of mind that your ballot has been received in time.
So that 8 p.m. on election day, that deadline, that applies to drop boxes. If it's 7:59, I can drop my ballot in that drop box and that's counted.
Yes.
Correct.
And Dory, Al mentioned some of the security that drop boxes have. We've just heard so much about drop boxes, and are they secure? Are they insecure? Can you tell us a little bit about what Montgomery County has?
Absolutely. Yes. So we have, actually just released our plans for drop boxes. So we have 12 drop boxes for the general election, the 11 outdoor drop boxes that our residents are used to. And then we also placed a 12th drop box in the lobby of One Montgomery Plaza, which is our county headquarters. The 11 outdoor drop boxes are available starting October 29th from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. They will be staffed. And then the drop box that's inside of our lobby will also be staffed, but it will be available for a longer stretch of time to enable folks who need those extra hours. So that will be available on weekdays from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. and on weekends from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. Because that is when our county security is available in the building. Our drop boxes are, ballots are picked up from those drop boxes daily by county security. We do have a chain of custody process. So when a voter drops their ballot into the drop box, it actually goes inside of a bag. For lack of a better term, it's a sturdy kind of four-sided bag that has a zipper closure that locks and has a seal on it, very similar to just a different shape the ballot bags that the poll workers use to return the ballots to us at the end of the night. So when we set up the drop boxes, they have that bag in there. They have a seal in a little pouch. We know what the number is on the seal. The county employee, security employee goes and picks them up. They fill out what time it is. They're all on camera. They're in a county vehicle. They write down that seal number. They bring it back to us. We make sure the seal number on the receptacle that was returned to us has the same serial, like same seal number that we issued to it. And then we retrieve the ballots from it, timestamp them, check them in, so on and so forth. So those that security personnel is very much a part of that. They are part of our team, really an extension of the voter services team. And so on and so forth, so that it's kind of a rotation. So they take the full receptacle out, they put a new one in, and the process starts, keeps repeating. So those drop boxes will be locked at 8 p.m. every night, and then reopened again at 8 a.m. every morning.
So this, you said the chain of custody process. I just want to make sure I understand correctly here. Once my ballot is in the Dropbox, it sounds like what you're describing is like the only people touching that ballot are either your direct employees or it's like somebody like a police officer or something, but nobody else is touching that ballot. Everybody
works for the county. So whether they work for me directly, they work for the commissioners. Like they are all Montgomery County employees.
Okay. And this sounds a little bit obvious, but there's just so much misinformation out there. Can you explain a little bit about like, why is that chain of custody important?
I mean, we need to make sure that we know where ballots are all of the time. I mean, even if we, at One Montgomery Plaza, Montgomery County is a little bit unique where our mail-in counting facility is in a different location than One Montgomery Plaza. We just had more space in one building than another building. So when voters drop their ballot off at One Montgomery Plaza, we still need to transport them to our central mail-in. We still take a chain of custody between those two buildings. It's important to us to maintain accurate inventory, that we are maintaining a voter's trust, that if I take something and they're well, I wouldn't transport ballots, but if something is leaving one building, we know what time it left and we have a relative idea of what time it should arrive there. Same thing with judges of election. When they leave their polling location and their paperwork says that there is supposed to be 200 voted ballots in this bag, when we receive it at Voter Services, there should still be 200 voted ballots in that bag. So it's the same concept.
It's also critical, Jonathan, as far as chain of custody, to ensure that a batch of ballots doesn't get misplaced or get lost somewhere, accidentally set down and covered up by another box of something else. And then all of a sudden you're on election night or you're starting to process. So if you have strong chain of custody, those types of issues, hopefully you can always avoid.
Got it. So in thinking of the chain of custody process, it's not just that making sure that, some ballots don't disappear. It's not just making sure that some don't appear out of nowhere. It's also making sure that some don't disappear and reappear. Every ballot is in your hands from start to finish once it's been handed over to you. You know where they've been, how they've gotten to you, to the counting process.
Correct. We absolutely, we need to stay organized above everything else, but we need to know where everything is at all times. And even during our canvass, when we are bringing out the receptacles that we store them in, there are these large cabinets on wheels. We only ever bring out one at a time. And that's for an inventory management purpose as well. That way we know, okay, we started out with 12 cabinets. There were 100,000 ballots. Each cabinet has 10,000, this many ballots in each one. We're on cabinet 3. There are this many left. So that way we can more accurately predict how far we are in the process, how many there are to go, and can predict how long that's going to take.
Got it. And Jeff, I'm going to ask you to set the record straight on something that comes up a lot. Al mentioned this, but depending on which side of the aisle you're from, you might use the words third-party ballot delivery, or you might say ballot harvesting. But this idea of, this question of being able to return ballots other than your own.
And that's a tough look. It's always been an issue. It's been a tough issue that we all had to deal with over the years. So Pennsylvania law is very clear. You can only return your ballot either by mail or in person, unless you have authorization from a voter. So a voter who may have a disability of some sort, you can authorize someone to carry the ballot for you. I can't tell you how many times over the years that we had voters bring in their spouse's ballot to the counter, and we would politely tell them they couldn't, sorry, we could only accept your ballot. We had a lot of angry people, as you could imagine, but the law is the law, and it's important. Most people, just like the naked ballot issue, we have so many issues that unfortunately people don't pay attention to, and maybe don't even have a reason to pay attention to. And this is one of them. And to me, the outreach that we can do as a state to remind people, maybe that's one of the blessings that's occurred out of the issues that have arisen in the last couple elections with the ballot harvesting and the ballot trafficking terms. Look, I don't believe for a moment that the majority of those are ballot harvesting situations. Typically, it's a spouse or a family member carrying a ballot. We saw famously our own governor kind of get caught in that situation at one point too. So it happens even to the best of us, inadvertently perhaps, but it's important that one of the messages that we should emphasize is you carry your own ballot unless you have authorization from a voter to carry their ballot.
So just thinking about other ways in which people can vote, including voting with mail ballots and returning their ballots. Al, we heard a lot about early voting in 2020. There were lines, there were parties, there were DJs, there was all sorts of stuff going on in Philly. What is the status of that? Do we have early voting in Pennsylvania, and how does that work?
We do not have early voting in Pennsylvania. We do have the ability for voters to apply in person for a mail-in ballot at a Board of Elections office. And if that application is approved, to receive their ballot, and if they choose to return it on the spot. Early voting, as some states have, allow voters to show up in the days before Election Day to cast their vote, on a voting system, whether it's a hand marked paper ballot or some other ballot marking device or something like that. We don't have that. We have the ability for voters, as we always had, to pick up on where Jeff started, where we always had with absentee ballot voting. Someone is about to go on a trip, they go to the Board of Elections office, they apply for an absentee ballot. The Board of Elections office determines whether that application is going to be approved or not based on the information that's provided, gives the voter that ballot with the other materials. Voter can fill it out on the spot and return it. So technically we don't have early voting in Pennsylvania, but we do have the ability for voters to cast their vote before Election Day, just as we always had with absentee ballot voting, just on a bigger scale.
So we are heading into another big election with vote by mail. A lot of people are going to vote by mail. A lot of people are going to vote in person. As we said, there's a lot of litigation. There's all sorts of ideas out there. I just want to get from all of you some of your thoughts on how we actually improve mail voting in Pennsylvania, whether you want to fix a problem or you just want to make things better in some other way. Dory, why don't we start with you? How would you improve mail voting in Pennsylvania?
So as Al mentioned earlier, pre-canvassing is one of the topics that I think as an election director would be the most beneficial to me. 37 other states in our great nation have kind of led the way on being able to open, or at least in some form or fashion, pre-canvass their ballots. This past July, Act 88 passed, which sort of doubled down on some of the concepts of Act 77, where you do need to have a central mail scan facility or some kind of operation within your county seat at your Board of Elections office to canvass or pre-canvass and canvass your mail-in ballots. You cannot start until 7 a.m. When you are a county as large as Montgomery, That means doing potentially working many, many hours at a time to canvass over 100, or as we saw in 2020, 253,000 mail-in ballots. You're not able to be, you're not able to produce the results that Pennsylvanians are looking for on election night. And it's, at times, I feel it can be an operational challenge or a logistical, you need a lot of logistical foresight to be able to operate an in-person election and a mail-in canvass simultaneously. So Act 88 passed this just in July, did lay out some terms that we must start at 7 a.m. on election day. And I have no doubt that this wasn't a change for Montgomery County. We have always run our mail-in canvass in at the same time as polls are open. It's a beautiful symphony. That's how I kind of describe it. Conducting 2 elections at the same time. It's a great time. The other thing that I would say is just more communication and more voter education. I am fortunate to have a dedicated resource that goes out into the community and speaks about just all aspects of voter education, whether it's registration or absentee balloting, becoming a poll worker, mail-in voting, all the aspects of everything that elections tackles. But to see something like that pushed statewide, I think would be really wonderful. In 2020, we saw a lot more engagement on the airwaves, on radio waves and things like that. We sort of haven't seen that level of educational resources since then. I think that just educating the public on not just the online resources, but directing them back to their county election offices throughout the year would be beneficial.
All right, nice list. Jeff, what can you add to that list? How would you improve
Number
voting?
one, I'll emphasize or reinforce Dory's mention of pre-canvassing. So that to me is number one. I think our lawmakers are going to be a little bit disappointed when they realize that law is not going to impact the speed of reporting as much as I think they had anticipated it might. Most of our counties were already doing what Dory's county was doing, which was starting on election day morning. So unfortunately, that still needs addressed. The other thing that we talked about earlier, a couple other legislative changes, which clearly would hopefully eliminate the need for litigation, notice and cure. So we really do need to take a serious look at itemizing what that process should look like. So all counties are doing it the same. And our Dropbox issue, as always, is still out there. And I think our General Assembly could help our counties by placing both of those issues as well as pre-canvassing into statute.
And Al, how would you improve mail voting in Pennsylvania?
I would say quickly, first of all of these issues are best solved by the legislature passing laws and a governor signing them that improve the process and remove any of this uncertainty. So across the board, mail-in pre-canvassing of mail-in ballots, in my limited experience, I have yet to come across an election administrator in the Commonwealth in any county, red or blue, who doesn't want to be able to do that, because it in no way compromises the integrity of the process. It only allows for not having to work 24 hours a day for days on end, so that voters get the results at the earliest possible opportunity when they're accustomed to it. I'd say, a couple other things, putting the hand-dated, not hand-dated issue to rest. I think that would be one, because it is a requirement in the law. The courts have said that it's an unnecessary requirement. The courts are an unfortunate kind of place to have to go to sort that out. It would be best resolved by the legislature. I would also suggest revisiting the requirement that mail-in ballots have to be returned in a secrecy envelope. I'd require all counties to mail out secrecy envelopes, but if the voter fails or chooses to return their ballot not in a secrecy envelope, I don't know what that has to do with the voter's eligibility. And I don't know what that has to do with the vote, with that being the voters' vote, or why their vote shouldn't be counted. Just the same as if you're in person on election day and you don't close the curtain behind you in a voting booth. Does that mean your vote shouldn't count? Like that's pretty absurd. And the other aspect, which is a little bit more complicated, is the issue of signature verification, which a lot of other counties do. I think that's worth, a lot of other states do. And I think that's worth, taking a look at as well, to see if that can further improve confidence in the integrity of the process. But all of these things are very interrelated. Like you can't do something like signature verification and not allow for pre-canvassing of mail-in ballot envelopes, or else we'd still be counting the 2020 election today.
We still are in some places.
We're still fighting it out, even though it's, wasn't close and it's the most safe and secure election in the history of our country. But other than that, yes.
All right, well, we are in the middle of another one. These are some really interesting ideas, and we'll see what happens with them in the future. For now, in the most immediate future, I hope anybody who wants to vote by mail has learned a little bit more about some of the safeguards in place and some of the things that they should do, like make sure you put your ballot inside that secrecy envelope and then put it inside the mailing envelope, sign that mailing envelope, date that mailing envelope, get it in on time, which means put it in a Dropbox, mail it back, hand deliver it, but get that in by 8 p.m. on election day. We are going to keep talking about mail voting, but that is it for tonight. Hope everybody joins us, and tell your friends, tell your family, tell your enemies, tell everybody. Join us next week, same time, same place, 6:30 on Wednesday. We are going to talk about the processing and the counting of mail ballots, and that is going to be with Karen Barsom from Chester County. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope to see you all here next week.